Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Needed Conversations. My name is Victoria Cole. This is Ryan Cole, my husband, and we are having or continuing our conversation about sex. We broke down the acronym SPICY, and we just wanted to kind of replace each letter with a word so that you guys can kind of remember what's the purpose for sex.
And so why God designed it, yeah.
Yeah, and last week was kind of more explicit, and we kind of gave a disclaimer, but this one's a little bit more, different. So even if your children are around, I don't think they're going to hear anything explicit. So, yeah.
Yes. So we've been breaking down SPICY, and so last week was the S, and we talked about the fact that God created sex to be satisfying. That's the S, which essentially means it's supposed to be pleasurable. And if you missed last week's episode and you want to know, how God says in his word that we're supposed to engage in sex and how it's supposed to be pleasurable, you can go back and listen to that episode. We even talk about kind of the do's and don'ts and things that most people have questions. I've gotten DMs about the different acts and etc. So go back and listen to that spicy conversation. Make sure you're subscribed, especially if you're on YouTube, but also to our podcast. Rate it. Let us know how you're enjoying these conversations and what you're getting out of it. And you can actually text us anytime. You can either text the word dating or marriage to 864-428-7131. 864-428-7131. We'll be sure to respond, answer some questions, maybe back to you if they're personal or live on air. We will never call you out, if you send us a personal question.
We'll always kind of keep it anonymous,
Absolutely.
Just for your protection.
But we wanted to preface that before we jumped into today's conversation as we continue to break down what God's purpose is for sex. So we talked about the satisfaction part. That's the S. It's supposed to be pleasurable. And today we're breaking down the P. And the P is three words that I want us to kind of dive into in our conversation. God designed sex for procreation. That feels rather obvious. Partnership and prophetic activation. In Genesis 1:28, then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. This was the first commandment God gave to Adam and Eve, to be fruitful, multiply the earth, fill it, and subdue it. And that is our dominion mandate. And when you're talking about sex, it's literally the first thing God told to the married couple. And that's the first thing that I would tell to every married couple. When you get married, but throughout the course of your marriage, have sex. Sex is good for you. And it's not just good in terms of the satisfaction that you feel physically, the pleasure, but the act itself is very prophetic in nature. It's procreative in nature, and it infuses you into this one flesh process, which is this partnership that God designed the marriage to be.
It's interesting because when I think of the word procreation, most people go to children. But I think it goes deeper than just the children itself, because I think there's just this unity that happens. And we have said, even in the previous episode about the sexual act, it's not just the specific sexual act. It's whenever you guys actually become one. Because when Adam was, one man, God took out of him a wife. And then, and God said that it's not good for him to be alone. So he wanted them to join together. And all those three P's kind of work together, where it's procreation, where it's partnership, and it's prophetic activation. They're kind of like simultaneous. So it's not only talking about children, because there are people that are struggling to have children. I'd like to address that as well. So that doesn't mean that, you're not procreating in a sense if you're having trouble having children here and physically, because there's different ways to have procreation, of course. If you are not able to do it in a natural, there's ways to adopt or whatever means that you can to be able to also give back to the world. And I know it's a hard topic and there's many things that we can cover on that, but and you're absolutely right, because if you look at the scripture that we just read, Genesis 1:28, it's almost like God is repeating himself, but God
never repeats himself seemingly without there being some underlying mystery to why he's repeating himself. And it's particularly true here because on the onset, you think, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. It's like saying, there, in the English language in particular. It's the same word, essentially. But if you look at the nuance of the words, especially in the original language, you look at the context that it was in, and you look at the Bible as a whole, you realize that these are layers to procreation. It's exactly what Victoria said. Replenish the earth, the last thing he stated, was the physical act. Yes, we need to procreate physically. We need to have children. That's what God said he wanted from the marriage. In the book of Malachi, he said he hated divorce. And he said, what do I want from the marriage? Children of God. Not just children, but children of God. And so that puts a direct emphasis on his purpose in replenishing. That's the third thing that he mentioned. Before he said replenish, he said multiply and be fruitful. So be fruitful and multiply really deal with the spiritual aspect and the soulish aspect. And this is very relevant. If you've read my book, I Love You More, Most, and Forever, you realize dating and marriage comes as a 3-phase approach. And really, it's shadowing the tabernacle of Moses, the outer court, inner court, and holy of holies. And here you have this, as he's speaking to the husband and the wife, displayed in his first command to them. These 3 specific instructions. Be fruitful, which deals with your spiritual nature and who you are and your identity. Since you were created in my image, as you are fruitful, I want you to create others who are also in my image and likeness. Most people forget that likeness. We always say we're created in the image of God and his likeness. What is the likeness? His character, his nature, his goodness. And so when God's telling us to be fruitful, he's saying the seed, the God-like nature that I've put on the inside of you, replicate that. Continue to produce. It's like what is referenced in the New Testament as the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, kindness, goodness, gentleness, meekness, self-control, of which there is no law. Is the fruit of the Spirit. You've got to be connected to the source, and you're multiplying yourself. And that's that second word, multiply, which really deals with the soulful aspect and building a culture that you can pass down to the next generation. So you've got the spiritual, the soulful, and the physical. But the physical comes last. Yes, he wants us to physically replenish the earth. But what's far more important than just simply having kids is establishing what it is you're going to pass to them. There's plenty of people having kids. A lot of people even outside of marriage. And we see what happens when we have the duplication of physical bodies, but not the duplication of godly values. It leads to destruction. And especially if you experience something like infertility, we can oftentimes look at that as, what is the word I'm looking for? It can feel very self-defeating, or you feel less than. When, God is the one who opens and closes wombs. And it's his timing, and us having to trust that process can be very hard, especially when you experience things like miscarriage. However, your emphasis shouldn't just be on me having a child physically, but what are the values? What are the spiritual aspects? What is the culture that I want to pass on to the next generation? Period. Whether that comes through your own blood and flesh, or whether that comes through an adopted child, or whether that's you adopting kids at your church. Not really, but, becoming a mentor, a big brother, a big sister, and being able to pass on values to the next generation that reflect the nature of God.
Yeah, that's so good. I heard it say like this, in the Bible, it doesn't say fruits of the Spirit. It says fruit of the Spirit, but it lists, 9 qualities of that fruit. And so when I think of like one encompassing fruit, but when you open the fruit, there's seeds in there, and those seeds are able to multiply and create more trees. I mean, that apple came from, a big tree, but then you are able to plant those seeds in expand it. So it's almost like procreation is like creating more plants beyond you, not keeping that fruit and just eating it and throwing away the seed, but actually using those seeds to plant to create expansion of, like you said, your values, your morals. You know, it could be somebody that you're mentoring at work, or somebody, a friend that you're pouring into, or a spouse, or whatever it is. That's also part of procreation, not just physical.
I heard somebody say, well, it's a rather famous quote, you know, you can count the number of seeds in an apple, but you can't count the number of apples in one seed. And what's inside of you has generational impact. And your marriage itself has a generational impact, whether or not you realize it. And that's why it's important that we don't approach this relationship from a passive perspective, but we're intentional about our marriage being drawn together with a common mission. And that's how that procreation fits into that second P, which is partnership. You know, because if you're going to procreate, again, it's not just a physical thing. You're passing something to the next generation. You realize your marriage is more than just you two, that it's about something bigger than yourself. It's about your marriage becoming a tabernacle for the glory of God. You say to yourself, what is it that we're partnering to do? And we say, where's this thing going? What is the mission that's driving our marriage? Because I say this often, but it has to be drilled home. Marriages without a mission always fail.
Yes.
No matter how infatuated with each other you are. Two lines that are focused towards one another intersect and cross and move in different directions. That's the average marriage. They're very excited and the relationship is very intense in the dating and engagement period. They're obsessed with one another, yet they're not asking the bigger questions. They're not moving beyond the surface level, which is, you know, what are we going to do with our lives beyond just this physical thing?
Yeah, and you know, one thing that I would address, you know, we're really big about marriage having a mission, because a lot of times we see frustration carried in the family because of lack of vision. And when a man is kind of, you know, is the head of the house, whenever he does not have a vision, we tend to see that frustration trickle down, you know, to the spouse, to, you know, their wife, their children. And, you know, since we're talking about seeds, it's kind of interesting how we're talking about partnership and how the seed needs the soil. And so the man provides the seed, you know, vision as well. And the woman is the incubator. So I would consider a woman like a soil. There's a lot of unknown elements in the soil, and it's like an incubator. And there's times when that seed is deposited and you may not see something for a long time. But once it sprouts, you know, in that little seed, you may think it's so small, but the branches expand. You know, I'm a gardener, so I see how big and massive it gets out, and how you can not only like create more fruit from the actual fruit that you already have, but you can actually like take some of the branches and propagate them and make more trees. Like, that's how powerful this is. And that's where we see that partnership come into play. And that's the same thing. It's not like a physical procreation, but it could also be vision. Like, if a man has a vision and you guys both agree, then I feel like you guys are simultaneously working together to produce fruit, to produce a harvest.
Yeah, and that's God's plan of expansion, is to multiply his glory and power. And how do you do that? Well, science tells you that, right? Is that if you split an atom and you bring it back together, you multiply the power. Einstein discovered that. In splitting the atom, you could create this explosive power by which men, in their sinful ways, created the nuclear bomb. And really, that was a God idea. He in heaven, even with all of his angels, he said, it's in me to expand my glory and my goodness as far as I can. How do I multiply this? Well, he took a piece of himself, he put it in the earth, right? And then by communing with the piece of himself, walking with Adam in the cool of the day, he multiplied the power therein. And God's glory and goodness was multiplied upon the earth. And that process didn't stop there. God then turned to Adam and said, listen, if I did this, we're going to do this with you as well. It's not good that man be alone. So he pulled the wife out of the husband. And when they come together in intense fellowship, aka sex, they are entering into that same multiplying release of power kind of act.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing that we engage in when we worship God and we're connecting with him in prayer spiritually. There's a multiplication of power. The portals of heaven are opened up. The same thing happens in sex, except there's a portal that opens up between you and your spouse. There's a mutual understanding. You are coming together with a common mission, whether you know it or not in that moment. You know, realizing that sex is more than just a physical act, but there is a prophetic activation. That's that third P. As you are focused together on a common mission, sex kind of activates that. It brings all of the right chemicals together, not just physically, but hormones, and there's something that happens in your soul that binds you together. This is this one flesh process and activates that mission that you have together. Like I said, two lines that focus in on one another obsessively move in opposite directions eventually. That's how marriages start out very powerfully infatuated upon one another, and then eventually they hate each other. It seems very extreme, but it's very common. But two parallel lines moving in the same direction. This is what God wants, that we both are looking towards the mission of creating children of God. That's what the book of Malachi says. That I want you to create children of God. Discipleship is at the core of your relationship, and sex seals the deal, so to speak. But what's fascinating in science is that they've discovered that two objects that move parallel out into space in the universe, at some point, something supernatural happens that's unexplainable. Those two objects converge and become one. And that's exactly what God does with the marriage. As we are completely focused on his mission to disciple the world, starting with our home, we, in obsession, not on each other, but upon Jesus Christ, become morphed into one being, in that we are one flesh. 100 and 100 coming together, multiplied power is released. That's how powerful sex is. It makes you think twice about such a passive act, right?
Yeah, I think that's where there's so much disjointing. Whenever you do step out of the covenant and you do partake in this activity, it's not only just a physical act and that sense of feeling, shameful and filthy and whatever else comes with it, that condemnation. It's also the fact that now your mind is in turmoil because you have connected with a person. You don't know what they're dealing with
who
as
don't
well.
have capacity for you.
Yeah, and you don't have that covenant with them. So there's this disjointing, and now your mind is in a swirl, and you just don't even know what to do with your emotions, with your mind, and how to move on from that. I mean, there's definitely redemption for those of you who are struggling with that, and we hope that you plug in with the right community and stay accountable because God wants you to be in a covenant relationship where that sex is that powerful tool that we're talking about.
Amos 3:3 says, "Can two walk together except they be agreed?" Right? So we're talking about partnership and prophetic activation. When you have sex outside of marriage, you may be connecting physically, but if you don't have a covenant, then there's really an underlying disagreement that's going on. Everything in your soul is sabotaging one another because there's no God thread that's holding and weaving you together. It's all based on superficial, selfish ambition. And God wants us to be in agreement. I mean, the same thing can happen in marriage as well. If the couple aren't in agreement, they're not communicating, realizing that sex starts outside of the bedroom. It's this constant communion that you have with your spouse, staying in tune with the rhythms, their emotions, what's going on with them, and then engaging in sex, understanding that it's to serve one another, but it's also to understand one another.
Yeah.
Sex is this supernatural thing. You said it, I think, last week or the week before. kind of like speaking in tongues. If you come from a Pentecostal background, it's an unknown language that you yourself don't quite understand, but you're speaking to God, and mysteries are revealed, and it builds you up. James says, build yourself up in your most holy faith. Well, sex is that supernatural thing that you don't quite understand why it's so powerful, but you realize it because you feel it in your life. You feel it in your gut. You know it within your heart of hearts that giving yourself to a person, something spiritual and supernatural is taking place. You feel it in your emotions, especially if you're a virgin going into marriage. That first year, you are experiencing those balances of your emotions and hormones, and you feel everything, both for men and women. You are coming into your full manness or womanness. And I don't know, you can explain what that felt like for us, because we were both virgins when we got married. What was that first year emotionally like for you?
It's physically, your body getting used to that. Of course, there's the hormonal levels, but there's also, like you said, there's a lot of just this different communication that's going on. And it's understanding, like, there's times, when you're down or feeling or experiencing something, you may not have to communicate that to me. I feel like that I take that on inside of me, even though I don't really understand why I'm feeling the way I do, but it's just kind of translates because I am an incubator. I take what you give me. So that's how powerful sex is.
It's particularly true for females because God built you innately, even your physical body, to be a receptor. Not that, sex outside of marriage isn't harmful for men as well. It definitely is. But I think even more so for women, because you are the incubator, like she said, for dreams. You're the incubator. You are the prophetic womb for your family. You think you just have a womb to give birth to children, but there's more than that. You're a prophetic incubator for visions and dreams. And so when you have sex outside of marriage, you take into yourself the burdens and the struggles and even the demons and the everything of that other person. But in marriage, like you were just saying, it's a way for you to connect and even know and understand the burdens that I'm carrying as a husband that I can't quite communicate. Like when we're intimate, you pick up on those frequencies and you're able to bear that burden with me, both in the act of sex, but also in prayer, in intercession, knowing that what you felt, not only in that moment, but just even afterwards, the day after, or
the 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, you feeling that.
It's interesting. I'm going to go to my biology class when I was studying in school. The way your body is made, God made it, is whenever your hormones are released, it actually looks for a receptor to attach to. So your hormones are released and it attaches to a receptor, and then once it connects, that's when the functions or whatever manifests in your body, whatever it is that's going on, And so it's so interesting that we are like those receptors, we're waiting for that thing, that seed or whatever that's floating to connect to. And when we connect, that's when it connects and shows up in the physical. And
it literally is a spark of electricity. I was talking to a scientist friend of mine, and he was talking to me about the sperm. And a sperm is literally an electric pulse that when it hits the egg, there is a spark of light and electric energy, etc., that is released inside of the woman. And as we're referring to marriage as the tabernacle is concerned, in the most holy place, the Ark of the Covenant was literally an electric conduit. The way that you combined the metals of gold and the wood and the way that it was shaped was literally a conduit, like a lightning rod, which understandably, when people touched it when they weren't supposed to, they dropped dead. It was like being struck by lightning. That's how powerful sex is as well. It's a spark of electric force. It's the life of God, the power of God that connects you both. So that's the P: procreation, partnership, prophetic activation. And this conversation is really just getting started. I want you to stay with us for the next several weeks as we continue. I think this is even good for single people to hear.
Yeah, this is powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It helps you understand why you should stay celibate. Anyways, we can get into all of that, which will continue on as we go into the I, the C, and the Y in this word spicy. And we're also going to be talking about why sex is good for men and why sex is good for women. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, like this, and share it to let other people know. If you got some married friends, even some single friends that you think could benefit from this information, send it on to them. And don't forget, we do have a number that you can text anytime with your questions, 864-428-7131. 864-428-7131. Any final words?
Yeah, well, this has been a needed conversation. We were so glad that you joined us for this episode. Be sure to join us next week. Every Monday, we have a new episode come out, so be sure to join us then.
See you then.